Thank you everyone here for joining us this afternoon for our panel, The Race No One's Ready For, Mobility Beyond the Car. I think we can agree that mobility is no longer just about cars. It's air mobility, micro-mobility, connected infrastructure, and smart cities, all moving at a pace that's faster than our traditional energy, supply, and manufacturing systems were designed for. This creates real pressure points. How do we ensure the energy grid can support the demand for ever-increasing vehicle usage? How do we build infrastructure that safely integrates scooters, drones, and autonomous shuttles? States like Michigan are taking a proactive approach, not just reacting. By aligning policy, investment, and innovation, they're enabling new mobility sectors to scale safely and efficiently. And industry has a critical role. Execution, partnerships, and smart systems aren't optional. They're what make the future of mobility real rather than just aspirational. Here to help us dig deeper into this topic is Justine Johnson from the MEDC Corporation's Chief Mobility Officer, Dan Radomski, Chief Executive Officer at Lawrence Tech University Centrepolis Accelerator, and Aaron Rivers, CEO of Emotiv Mobility. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Okay. So Justine, I want to start with you. We're going to dive in from where you sit. What feels fundamentally different about the mobility landscape today compared to even a few years ago? And after Justine, I'd like you all to answer that so you can think about your answers for that.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me here today. Again, Justine Johnson, Chief Mobility Officer for the state of Michigan. I lead an office called the Office of Future Mobility and Electrification. And actually, this is such a great question when we talk about mobility, which is traditionally, as you started in your introduction, has been a conversation that was once upon a time solely about automotive, and we are embracing mobility. And for us, our definition of mobility is anything that moves people, that moves goods, that move information across land, across water, and across air, and air as well. And so it is really thinking about how these traditional forms of how we've been moving, but also emerging innovations, how that's actually helping to drive more safety, efficiency, affordability, and more within our state. So that's something that's been really important to us, especially as we embrace this term of mobility. And I'd also say now, as part of mobility, it's not just about an internal combustion engine. You're also having this conversation about zero emissions and clean emissions vehicles as well as part of that ecosystem. So it's not just about a one type of propulsion system that utilizes diesel or gas. We're now having this conversation around zero emissions as well.
Dan, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, what I've seen a drastic change in the mobility market in the last 10 years, specifically around just adoption, right? We had, especially when we talk about autonomy and electrification and mobility systems, there was a lot of pilots and demonstrations, a lot of, insurance companies were trying to figure out the very litigious society in the U.S., but now we're seeing robo-taxis on the road. We're seeing real use of autonomy and everything. And outside the autonomous electric vehicle space, everything is moving towards autonomy and electrification, right? From tractors to electric ATVs to motorcycles to scooters to floor sweepers, lawn mowers, drones, everything, right? So it's just the products are more accepted. The markets are actually finally being created. And I think what's really different about today than 10 years ago, it's easy to look at the market just in systems and the great products that you actually drive or autonomously drive. But the entire supply chain has grown significantly. The demand for the key components that go in these systems, not just the autonomy stack, but the batteries, the e-drive system, the power electronics, it's gone through the roof. And to Michigan's credit and to Justine's credit, they saw that as an opportunity because Michigan is so good at developing products. We partnered on developing a Make It in Michigan mobility prototyping grant where it's open to companies all across the globe to come to Michigan to design and engineer and get their mobility products made right in Michigan.
So for me, I think it's probably the definition of technological advancement in traditional mobility. So if you go 10 years, 15 years ago, all of the technology was around the power plant, right? How can you be more efficient? What can you do differently? As you fast forward and you come this way, you see the shift from technology around the power plant to communication in the vehicle. And that change in communication, how that communication is paired in the vehicle, has now caused the baseline for us to think about changing the power plant now, right, to enable those types of activities. So for me, I think that's probably the biggest enabler that I've seen in the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, and as we talk about, changing and how the infrastructure is changing and how we're doing that, things are moving fast. And what do you see as, some of the pressure points going forward to make, mobility advance and to go beyond? You want to start, Aaron?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So
Yeah.
I think, as Dan mentioned, I think the number one is probably supply chain, right? Because the speed of innovation is that fast, and supply chains are having a difficulty catching up and maintaining that. That's one. I think the other is adoption, right? So I'll give you an example. 15 years ago, in the commercial vehicle space, the idea of driving a 56,000-pound missile down the road at 75 miles an hour without a mechanical connection between your hand through the steering wheel, through the steering column, through the steering gear, to the steering axle, to the wheel was unheard of. Engineers would laugh you out of a room with the idea of steer-by-wire in a commercial vehicle. That is not the case today, right? So those type of adoptive activities are still hurdles that I think we need to address, but I think we're coming a long way.
It's an interesting question. When I think of the pressures, I think they reside across the entire value chain. So I'll give you an example. For the companies that are developing mobility systems, take automotive OEMs, right? They're looking at autonomy, they're looking at even electrification of vehicles, and they're finding that their margins on EVs are far smaller than ICE, yet they're still required to kind of build for certain markets. And then you have the ride-sharing, companies, right? These robo-taxi companies, they're largely still not, revenue positive. It's really hard to develop a business model around, ride-sharing when you have to take all the capital intensity up front and then pay for it over time, for instance. So that's on the company side. Then there's the infrastructure side that you talked about a little bit. Is the grid prepared for it? Do we have enough EV charging? I was working with the local utilities, and they have a fleet of, hundreds of, Class A trucks that all go electric, all charge at the same pace. The transformers need to be updated. The entire grid needs upgrading. It's a very difficult situation and hard to plan for. And then the third way I would address that question is on the supply chain, as you mentioned. As the demand for autonomy stacks, increase, that's a demand on sensor systems, software developers, and then certainly if it's electrified, it's on the batteries and the e-drive systems and everything I mentioned, to the point where it's created pressure points globally and certainly in the U.S. as we try to reshore and onshore production capabilities.
I'd also add, from the lens of government and how we have to think about the role of innovation, especially when we talk about mobility. For us, that big piece of this is really making sure that consumers can adopt the technology. Interoperability is an important thing. Right. And we saw that very early, even when you think about ways in which you pay for whether that's public transportation, if you're a public transit rider, if you pay for tolls, there's so many different ways of doing that, and so you start to create confusion. When you start to have a system that is new, and if it's not seamless, you have pushback often. And so it's how do you manage that pushback, especially when you have a number of different systems that are being rolled out very quickly into the built environment. How are we educating consumers? How are we giving them that flexibility as well as just saying we have to learn as we grow? And for a number of companies that are also testing new technologies, they go through these really high levels of peaks and these really strong valleys. And that valley of death is really what prevents really great ideas sometimes from continuing on into the built environment. And so that becomes a challenge because a consumer finally gets comfortable with, let's say, their autonomous vehicle shuttle, and if that operator is no longer there, then you've now taken this thing away from consumers. And so you do have that demand that still is saying we need the service, but how do you fill some of those gaps, especially when some of the players are changing so rapidly?
Yeah, and I like what you said about, making sure the consumer can use the product and that they're comfortable with it. But I think as we circle back to something Dan said, and this is going to you, Aaron, we need the infrastructure behind, these mobility, ideas and innovations. We need to have the infrastructure that can support it. So we need the consumer to be able to use it, but even going back a step further, we need to have that infrastructure support. And I think Emotiv Mobility is helping to solve that problem. You want to dive in there?
I think, to go back to what Justine mentioned and also Dan as well, there's an interesting juxtaposition around the value chain, as you mentioned, right? So if you think about mobility in this country, quick history lesson, in order for us to have the mobility archetype we have now, you have to go back to post-World War II and the national infrastructure system for roads, right? That activity was funded 100% by the US government, right? And the Department of Defense. And then from that mobility as we know it grew out of that. So now you fast forward to today. Today, there's a very weird connection that does not exist between governments and between private sector, specifically for this shift in mobility. Now, the role we play. If you ask many mobility OEMs, or OEMs in general, how you transform mobility today, they'll say, yes, we want to do that. And you say, how? And then they draw a blank, right? Because why? Well, we don't have grid infrastructure. We don't have good electrification. We don't know how to make efficient changes in our architecture of our vehicles to be adopted. We know that jumping completely to electrification is not the thing to do. So now how do we backpedal and come out with a solution that makes sense? So we as a tier 1 OEM with many, a tier 1 supplier to OEMs with many of our OEM customers, we took a step back and said, how can we help define what that mobility transformation looks like? And as we did that, we said, okay, what is this the story of? So the story arc here for us in mobility transformation is the story of the electron, right? From its generation, through its distribution, through its use in a vehicle, and then obviously the OEM's use that goes to the commercial market. So we are adapting policies and divisions that help define that through products and services to our OEMs to help that transformation come about.
Thank you for that. I think that's hugely important, as we look to make sure we have the infrastructure. But I'm going to pivot a little bit, and this is a little bit of a wild card question. Since I can be moderator, I get to do it. But anyway, I think we need to just talk a little bit about the talent piece around that and how, Dan, you're at Lawrence Tech University, and how we're preparing, the generations that are coming into the workforce to go into these fields of mobility and how we can help support, because I know we're all struggling to find the talent to do that. You want to start, Dan?
Yeah, we can talk a little bit. I'd love for Justine and others to contribute to this. So I used to run a electric vehicle engineering firm, Tier 1, and we had operations in Michigan as well as Nanjing, China, and Europe. And we developed fully autonomous vehicles, electrified vehicles. And so I was in that position where I had to hire, I had talent shortages, and there are very specific areas, and those same pinch points are still there today. So it really depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about the development of the mobility systems, there's still pinch points in battery engineers, specifically those that are not so much on the battery cell production, because we don't produce a lot of cells here in the US. That might be more of a constraint in China and South Korea and other areas that manufacture cells. But we do quite a bit of module design and pack design and production in the US, and particularly in Michigan. So it's engineers that have kind of a interdisciplinary capability of mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and thermal management engineering, and are really hard to find. And we just did a study for the state and validated that by interviewing all the Michigan battery companies that is still very much an issue. And then when it comes to motor design, it's a growing area, especially as we try to reshore our motor production. And we just don't have a lot of motor design engineering programs at universities. Power electronics is another constraint, right? You have a traction drive inverter and DC to DC converter in any electric vehicle of any type, including smaller micromobility systems. So there's only a handful of programs. Michigan State University is one, but only a handful across the nation. So many talent shortage areas. And again, as mobility grows, this is where the growth is going to be. It's going to be at the component level, especially as we start reshoring, onshoring more of that production of the subsystem and component level systems, whether it be sensors that go on an autonomous vehicle or the electrified components that go in a vehicle.
I'd say the workforce is such an important factor when we're talking about mobility innovation. And we have to make sure that the workforce is skilled, that they're trained. In some places, they have to be reskilled and retooled to take on the full opportunity and advantage of being in the mobility industry. One of the things that I'm always so proud of the state of Michigan from a historical point of view is the state of Michigan has really was the birthplace of the American middle class. And so you think about the role of someone being able to work at an automotive plant and what that meant for them in terms of purchasing their first home, sending those kids to college, doing so many things that enabled it really change the dialect and conversation around versus the haves versus the have-nots, and you have a population that's literally making things, and that was made not only for the automotive sector, but also supported in the defense space as well. And so many other industries have been supported because of having a legacy automotive industry. And so when we talk about what that next wave of the industry looks like, we talked about it from the lens of automotive, whether that's maritime, whether that's aviation, those are more opportunities for folks who currently are in work to transition and also get the skills that they need. And the state of Michigan has a number of programs and initiatives, one being the Michigander Scholars Program that works with university students, placing them to work in the automotive sector. There's the EV Jobs Academy, which brings the automotive industry leaders together with the state to build out curriculum so that people can be trained and tooled for those opportunities within electrification. One of the great initiatives as part of the Office of Future Mobility and Electrification, 2 programs we have. One is called Changing Lanes, and we really started this program because we saw as the number of people were getting laid off in the automotive industry, we didn't want that talent to leave. That's so much talent when we think about our entrepreneurs who are looking to be connected to the automotive sector, and as well as those who might have been working in the automotive industry for years, may have even patented some really great innovations, but never had the pathway or the courage to be an entrepreneur themselves. So it's really thinking about, we had our first cohort last year, but really pushing folks to either support the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Michigan or become an entrepreneur yourself. And lastly, we have another program which has been really successful. It's the Michigan Future Mobility Fellows Program, and that's bringing recent college graduates to work in Michigan either with innovators or with transportation agencies. So it's really important for us that we make sure that our workforce is skilled and that they are tooled and they're trained for the opportunities of the future. We have the highest concentration of engineering talent in the United States. Innovation is always going to live in Michigan. There's no way around it.
Yeah, great. Aaron, anything you'd like to add? Or
No, I think it's been said very well. If you think about Michigan and you think about the amount of entrepreneurs both in the state and out of the state that have been driven by the mobility sector over time, whether it be auto racing, whether it be passenger car, whether it be commercial steering or commercial vehicles, I think that push has done more than just the middle class, to be quite honest with you. I think it has driven our country, right? And if you think about the manufacturing impacts that has had, it is having there's a need for an additional impact today at the educational levels to focus on that next wave, right? You had a lot of post-war people coming back that were mechanically inclined, a lot of people coming from the farms that were mechanically inclined. That activity is missing now today, right? And we don't have a real curriculum that is set up to augment what is missing today. So I think that's just one of the things that through the programs that are being mentioned, that Michigan is being proactive in bringing those to the forefront.
If I'll add to that, it is because whether it's autonomy or it's electrification, it is this kind of interdisciplinary need. I mean, I didn't even talk about autonomy. You need a combination of embedded sensors, software engineering, robotics engineering, and controls engineering.
Right?
Yeah,
which was a word that didn't even exist, right, 15 years ago.
And we have a mechatronics program at Lawrence Tech. The state's backing a lot of these programs. And it's really important to address that shortage like I talked about, because what happens when you have a shortage of talent in any area, the price of that talent goes way up. So the talent acquisition cost becomes very difficult for companies to afford employing them, and if they can, they get stolen by their competitor a month later, right? So.
Yeah, great, great. So as we have a couple core questions before we wrap up, but how would you say companies can prepare for mobility beyond just the car without slowing any innovation that's needed? I'm asking any of you that want to jump into that, so.
Well, I think part of that question is tied up on also how is the mobility industry going to grow when it has to develop all these autonomy and electrified platforms for such a wide variety of products. And right now, everything's like custom design, whether it's for a scooter or an e-bike or a drone, and so many different platforms. And I think the only way we're going to see it grow is by modularity of design of the key subsystems. So I've been talking about the battery system, the power electronics, the motor, right, the autonomy stack. We're seeing some companies do a pretty effective job of that, including in Michigan, where they're creating different modules for different power demand needs or different autonomy needs. And that is going to enable a supply chain that is not so strained like we were talking about, and ultimately allowing for quicker product design timelines and product to market timelines.
I will also say, too, it doesn't have to be an or conversation, right? It doesn't have to be automotive or. A lot of times it's an and conversation. And one of the things, and Dan and I are working very closely, especially as it relates to the work we're doing in the state of Michigan around drones. One of the things that makes us really prime for a lot of opportunities for drone manufacturing is the automotive industry.
Exactly.
And you think about the role that the automotive industry has played when you think about the arsenal of democracy, from building cars to then building warfighting equipment, and even most recently with COVID-19, transitioning at the drop of a dime to build PPE equipment and ventilators that went not just for the state of Michigan, but for the rest of the United States. So you see healthcare there, you see defense, you see aviation, you see all of these different sectors that started with this foundational element of the automotive industry. And so it doesn't have to be one of those things where we're talking about these new form factors and so therefore the car is going away. No, we actually need the foundational elements of how we have built cars in order to understand how we're building the next propulsion system of the future, whether it exists right now or in the next 10 years. That is foundational. And so I think it's not I don't want to put them against each other, but all of these industries can thrive based on this strong foundation.
I think that the mobility market in general, you define that how you want to, handles technology in fits and starts, if I can put it that way. So if I were to poll the group and say, what was the number one technology that allowed us to have electric vehicles, as an example, right? Someone would maybe automatically jump to the powertrain, right? Going from combustion engine to electrification. That really is not it, right? The first technology that has allowed us to get to where we are here is ADAS systems and non-powered steering. That now has enabled the next wave of activity, which is what we're looking at. So when I think about those ebbs and flows and fits and starts, from a mobility perspective, what is the next at-large thing to tackle so that we don't hit a trough and then wait for that next thing, and then you see a lot of power and money spent into this next thing because it's not very cohesive or laminar. So I think that, for me, would be the next thing that I think as an industry we should be looking toward for mobility.
Yeah, and I like how you guys frame that up, right? It really is, it's the and conversation, right? We started with cars, we're talking about mobility, and we're talking about how our know-how and ability to manufacture to scale is going to allow us to push mobility forward, and I think that that's key. So as we wrap up, any final thoughts?
Of course, I always like to do my pitch for Michigan. Come to Michigan if you haven't. But we're doing some really fun things. And, again, I always like to make sure folks know we have the first wireless charging roadway in the United States right in Detroit, Michigan, something that we're really proud of. And we're really talking about how the infrastructure connects to the vehicles, but also how that also complements existing systems like public transportation as well. So we have a number of different initiatives. We work with a number of different partners across the state, but also if you're not in the state of Michigan, of course, as Dan and I have been talking about our program, the Make It in Michigan prototype program and prototype grant program, that's an important part of this conversation. In order for the software to be successful, we need to make sure that the hardware and the software can communicate with each other, and that requires manufacturing at all different levels. So I think that's something that continues to be at the forefront, and we're going to continue to push as much as we can to get to our broader goals around carbon neutrality for 2050. We know that the transportation sector does contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, so we're really focusing as well on reducing emissions within the state of Michigan, but also encouraging more innovators, more entrepreneurs, and making sure our workforce is prepared and ready for the opportunities of the future.
And I'll back that. I give a lot of credit to the Office for Future Mobility, Electrification. Justine's here. Charlie Tyson's at the back of the room too. Talk to us. Even if you're not in the state of Michigan and you want to look for opportunities, what I love about what Justine's organization has done is they've offered their grant programs and resources to companies outside the state. They often offer opportunities to pilot and demonstrate advanced mobility systems, land, air, sea, in Michigan. And then they have the opportunity that even companies outside the state can apply to the Make It in Michigan Mobility Prototyping Grant to get their system or key components developed in Michigan. So it's a really inviting state to bring advanced mobility in for both development of product as well as deployment and testing.
So I'm not a Michigander, just to be super clear, but it would be lost on me if I did not appreciate, first of all, the impact that Michigan and the manufacturing activity that comes out of Michigan has had in our country, specifically from a GDP impact perspective. So there's that. Again, not a Michigander, but we have chosen Michigan to be the pilot for a lot of our innovative activities, not only just for legacy activities, but also for new activities, because Michigan is providing an environment that makes this possible, probably more possible than you see. I'm reminded of the big push for technology, right? And there were quite a few Wall Street Journal posts and others that said Silicon Valley would be the next Detroit. That will never be the case. Detroit is Detroit, right? And the trickle-down effect that Detroit and Michigan has had on the overall U.S. economy, and again, from a GDP perspective, is one that we should all be rooting for, right? Because of the impact that has over the overall economy for the business. So again, not a Michigander, but definitely a plug.
Great. Well, that wraps up our mobility stage talk here. So Justine, Dan, Aaron, thank you so very much. Let's give them a
Thank you very
round of
much.
applause. They did great.